bears. This is the kind of go-to bugaboo for people talking about the North. You're about to set off on a journey. They don't say, be careful on those big lakes. They don't say, be careful of the cold water. They say, be careful of the bears. Take a shotgun. You know what? Take 2 shotguns. So the bears feature is very, very large in the imaginary of people, of the terrible things that can happen to you in the bush. What's your advice to people about bears?
Well, it's a bit like the other hazards that we've talked about, which is it's hard to give one size fits all advice because circumstances can vary depending on where you're going and what you're doing. But if you were to ask me to come up with my list of like the top 10 hazards that I worry about, bears would definitely not be in the top 5. And if they make the top 10 at all, they would be at the very bottom, just barely crack the top 10. Like I worry 100 times more about the weather, lightning. I had numerous lightning storms on my most recent journey. I worry way more about the wind. Wind is just, it can be terrifying. Not only on the water when you're paddling, but I've camped in many places where there's a significant hazard that a tree could fall on my tent in the night, and there's nothing you can do about it because it's like deadfall everywhere for hundreds of miles in all directions in Labrador. And a tree could fall over and crush you, or at least seriously injure you in the night. So wind, weather, those are things that I really worry about. Hypothermia, cold water, rapids, other things, just freak accident, slipping and smashing your head off a rock because you slipped in a boulder field doing a portage, or anything like that. I mean, any sort of unforeseen medical emergency. I worry about those sorts of things far more than I would about bears. In my experience, the vast, vast majority of bears are shy, and most of them, they'll run away as soon as you see you. Some that don't, if you make any sort of threatening gesture or noise, then they'll run away. And yes, of course, there are aggressive bears, and they're certainly capable of killing and attacking humans. But it's kind of like any risk factor, right? It'd be like, are you terrified of, walking down the street of Toronto or Vancouver at night? Well, I mean, statistically, yes, every year people do get attacked, murdered, any number of bad things could happen to them. But the risk is very low, and it doesn't really make sense to be completely worried about that when there are so many other things that could get you, right? Everyday hazards that we don't really think about, that we're cavalier about. So, of course, you don't want to be completely dismissive of the risk, but it's relatively low down the list.
Did your risk calculus change at all in Ungava Bay? Because now you're talking polar bears.
Yeah, so there were polar bears there. And, I'd be lying if I said they didn't make me nervous. They do. And I have a recurrent nightmare of a polar bear swimming under my canoe. This is partly because the water on almost all those northern rivers, not all of them, but the majority, is very clear. So you can see far down into the lake. And polar bears, of course, are excellent swimmers. I mean, they can swim faster than anyone can paddle a canoe. And sometimes I would see this huge white thing right underneath my canoe. And you would have a moment of terror, and you think that's a polar bear because they swim underwater. I mean, they're a marine animal, right? They live the vast majority of their lives on the water, frozen water, but on the water nonetheless. So I would think that's a polar bear. But what inevitably it is, there would be these giant boulders, white boulders, like all white boulders lying on the bottom of the water, the river or the coast, and it would look exactly like a polar bear through the distortion of the sky and the water underneath as you're paddling. And it's terrifying because, let's face it, if there actually was a polar bear under your canoe, you would have very few options. There'd be very little you could do about it if that polar bear intended harm. Yeah, I mean, you'd be essentially a sitting duck. Yeah. Even if the polar bear didn't eat you, if it so much as flipped your canoe, you'd be in serious trouble. So that's like a nightmare that I always have, that I'm going to see a polar bear underneath the water. Now, strangely enough, I wasn't really worried at the time because I was just sort of under the impression that even though I was theoretically, if you look up the range of a polar bear, I was within the range of polar bears. I just thought there wasn't going to be any around. I figured, this early in the year in July, polar bears are still offshore. They're out on the ice floes hunting seals. I doubt any of them will be hanging around on the coast here or coming inland, even less so. So it didn't really trouble my thought at all. And I didn't think too much about it. I mean, I took all the same precautions I normally would around black bears and things, but I just No, it never. I slept
Mm.
perfectly fine. And then when I actually reached the end of my journey, I came to a little tiny Inuit community called Kangasolajak. And when I coasted into shore there, it felt a little bit surreal. 3,400 kilometers, 90 days. And I come into shore there. And the first person I meet, this guy who I learned his name, Willie. And he's a local man there, Willie. And almost the first thing he says to me is that there were two polar bears swimming upriver, exactly where I just came downriver. So on a perfect collision course. And I was like, whoa, really? Like, I didn't think there were any polar bears. And he's like, well, yeah, all the ice is melted out on Ungava Bay. So there's no ice. So when the ice melts, they all go upriver to try to catch salmon. And I'm like, whoa, I'm really glad that I didn't know that at the time, because I wouldn't have slept a wink if I'd known that I just passed two polar bears coming downriver as I was going upriver.
They're probably under your canoe.
Yeah, well,
maybe those weren't white rocks.
Yeah, so he said they had just seen them, and of course I wanted to interrogate him and know everything about it. He said it was like I think a few days earlier, which was even more terror-inducing, because that's like, yeah, definitely I was right on a collision course with them, but I didn't see them, which is maybe, ignorance is bliss, so I didn't have to be terrified about it. But that definitely made me reconsider everything, where I thought like, yeah, there aren't any real polar bears around, but then it turns out actually there are. And then, of course, I had to ask him every polar bear story he had. He told me about someone who lived in the village who'd been attacked by a polar bear. She survived, luckily. But, I mean, even so, as maybe my example just demonstrates, it's not like, well, there's a polar bear, so you're definitely going to get eaten. Those bears paid no attention to me whatsoever, and I was fine.
Yeah.
But it's just such a difficult subject, really.
Yeah, I think polar bears are a different world from black bears and grizzly bears. I mean, there's lots of Inuit who are happy to camp inland in canvas tents when they're hunting caribou in the middle of winter, and that's perfectly normal. But you're not going to find very many Inuit, I'm going to go out on a limb and say none, who feel comfortable camping on the Hudson Bay coast in the summer, like in a tent. They just don't do it. And it's because of polar bears. That strip along the coast there is polar bear central. So they're happy to camp inland. They're happy, canvas tents, no problem. In the winter when all the bears are out on the ice anyway. But I think polar bears are just an entirely different. Well, they are an entirely different animal, but their ecology of being 100% carnivorous, or I think Wikipedia describes them as hypercarnivorous the last time I looked. That phrase scares me, hypercarnivorous. So I think that's worth carrying a 12 gauge and carrying one of those bear perimeter fences, those little alarms that you can stretch a monofilament line around your tent.
And they're also massive compared to black bears. So if you do meet with one, your odds of defending yourself are dramatically lower. Like, if you look at black bear attacks, humans have a surprisingly high success rate of successfully defending themselves. Like, just a little bit of fight oftentimes is enough to make a black bear leave. But your odds would not be good at all, like almost zero, you would think of a polar. The one example that Willie told me, the only reason the woman survived is her husband was there and killed the bear with a gun. That was the only reason. So, your odds of actually fighting one off with a knife or something, as has been done with black bears, would be very low.
Yeah, a dinner table with gigantic teeth.